All right, so in the tradition that we've established just a couple of years ago, there's a sort of speaking to the historical moment president's report that I'm going to proceed to give. Last year, I presented on the anti-Fa versus anti-imp left as a division in the history of the left that bears upon the present. Prior to that, I presented on the 1970s as a decade whose legacy informs the present, although usually in a way that's not acknowledged. This year, I'm presenting on what I'm titling 1873 to 1973, the Century of Marxism. And the reason that I, in consultation with my colleagues and my comrades, chose this topic is precisely as a way of grasping the crisis of 2007-2008 as a closing of a period of neoliberalism that began with the crisis in 1973. And so one of the things to consider, therefore, is the parallels and also lack of, a kind of disparity between the period from 1873 to, say, 1912 or 1917 versus the period from 1973 to today, or to the crisis of 2007-2008. And because I think that it bears upon our consideration of our present historical moment and how we might consider it. So a sort of provocative formulation that I have is to call 1873 to 1973 the Century of Marxism, meaning to sort of locate Marxism historically in this period. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this. But first I'd like to start, the reason that I put up on the screen, a number of dates to help us historically situate some figures in the history of Marxism that bear upon this discussion. So I have the birth and death years of various figures in the history of Marxism that are important for Platypus, namely Marx, Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Benjamin, and Adorno. And what we might say, therefore, is that this century of Marxism is after Marx, primarily, even though still the last 10 years of his life are included in this period, and that this century of Marxism roughly ends around the time that Adorno died. Somewhat in deference to our visitor Ben Lewis from the CPGB, I'm going to make mention to a discussion that Mike McNair made of the 2011 crisis, the Arab Spring, Occupy, in light of history. So, if 2011 was and is similar to, but different in certain key ways, from 1968 and 1999, this was due to the latter, to 1968 as a crisis year and 1999, the Seattle year, taking place during periods of economic boom, whereas 2011 took place during an economic crisis, during the economic crisis that began in 2007-2008. However, in terms of similarities and differences between 1968, 1999, 2011, what this comparison neglects about the question of economic crisis is that 1973, the crisis of Keynesianism and Fordism, occurred in the aftermath of the New Left explosion of 1968. Meaning one could say that 1968 took place during an economic boom, but the 70s phase of the New Left took place during a period of economic crisis in the 1970s. So neglecting the 1970s as a period in the history of the left neglects the last time that there was potentially a renaissance of the left during an economic crisis of the kind of order of magnitude we're talking about today, namely the 1970s. This points to the 1970s renaissance of Marxism in certain respects. What I'm going to argue is that the 1970s renaissance of Marxism, the sort of Marxist-Leninist turn of the New Left, mostly in the form of Maoism and Trotskyism, what this represented was not so much a renaissance of Marxism per se, but rather Marxism's long-delayed death. In other words, that Marxism didn't come back to life in the 70s so much as it finally died in the 70s. Now, this is quite different from considering the collapse of the Soviet Union to be a crisis and death of Marxism, so I'm going to explain what this means. It was in this period, in the 1970s, that renaissance of Marxism, that the crisis of Fordism led to the neoliberal era that the present crisis might prove to be some kind of a closure. By the end of the 1970s, this was epitomized by the election of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and the election of Reagan in the United States at the end of this period. If the current crisis is the crisis of neoliberalism, then it recalls the birth of the neoliberal era in the failure of the New Left, specifically the failure of New Left Marxism. In other words, that the Marxist-Leninist turn of the New Left is coincidental historically with neoliberalism. And we need to think about these things together, therefore. So neoliberalism is a phenomenon of the failure of the New Left. It was this failure that led to postmodernist anti-Marxism, specifically the death of the left in its post-political phase in the 1980s and 1990s, what we have in our kind of statement of purpose that we characterize the 80s and 90s as post-political, the post-political left. The question, therefore, is the century of Marxism as the emergence, crisis, death, and memory of Marxism. That question, the question of the emergence, crisis, death, and memory of Marxism, is what I'm trying to periodize between 1873 and 1973. Marx's own thought, of course, predates this period and is properly considered a phenomenon circa and in the aftermath of 1848. In other words, if we associate Marx with a historical moment, it's really 1848. If Marx's own thought, separable from the question of Marxism, Marx's own thought was born in the crisis of the 1840s, then Marxism, by comparison, Marxism, not Marx's thought, but Marxism, as a form of politics sui generis, a Marxist politics per se, dates from the collapse of the First International and the formation of the SPD in the 1870s. As such, it is contemporaneous with the First Great Depression, in the typical historiography, the First Great Depression that began with the crisis of 1873. In other words, the economic crisis of the latter part of the 19th century, the crisis of 1873 that had the result of a decade of depression in the United Kingdom, but also elsewhere, the Great Depression that began in 1873. Marxism as a form of politics distinct from other forms of socialism dates from this period. 1873 is commonly regarded as the end of the mid-19th century liberal era, which saw a certain heyday in the 1860s, when leftist politics emerged from post-1848 reaction. In Marxist historiography, it dates the emergence of the monopoly era of capitalism, and the era of modern imperialism, post-1873. And I'll say something about the 1860s for a moment. So the 1860s is, of course, the period, for instance, marked by the US Civil War and the formation of the First International. However, that period ended by the early 1870s, and Marxism emerged from the closure of that 1860s period. Significantly then, 1873 was a blow to, and not a boon, to the First International. If we take the First International to be paradigmatic of 19th century socialism, in other words, the First International really incorporated all of the key strands of mid-19th century socialism, that the crisis of 1873 did not boost 19th century socialism as much as was coincidental historically with a crisis of 19th century socialism, namely the collapse of the First International. This represented a shift. In other words, 1873 signaled a shift. This shift was bound up with other changes. The shift to Marxism was
also
bound
the
up
Depression followed a speculative boom.
in the 60s.
Right,
Yeah.
very similar to the present moment.
Usually in the historiography of capitalism, the changes associated with 1873, the crisis of 1873, and the depression of the 1870s are summed up in the shift from the liberal era to the state capitalist era of capitalism. Now, state capitalism is this funny category, and Friedrich Pollock was mentioned, and there are other sources for this. State capitalism can be dated in two very different senses of the term. One would be 1873 and the kind of Bismarckian kind of project of state socialism. The other being 1914 and World War I and the kind of statification of capitalism that came in the crisis and in the prosecution of World War I by the various antagonists in World War I. The fact that state capitalism can be characterized as having such very different start dates is itself significant. It places specifically the period between them under certain questions. In other words, if we say state capitalism is either a phenomenon of the 1873 crisis or a phenomenon of World War I, then we have to look at that period, 1873 to 1914, in a particular way. This period is coterminous with another historiographic period, the Belle Epoque, or the time between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. In France, this is the period of the Third Republic, after the collapse of Louis Bonaparte's Second Empire and the suppression of the Paris Commune. This is also the period of Marxism. In other words, it's significant that Marxism, in its, in a sense, classic phase, from the formation of the SPD to its crisis in World War I, is coterminous with the period of state capitalism. Thus, Marxism in its classical era can be considered a phenomenon of the turn to state capitalism. Marxists of this period called this era imperialism, or the highest stage of capitalism. In other words, the emergence of Marxism as a politics sui generis is also understood by Marxists of the era as being capitalism's highest possible stage. The late 19th and early 20th century period of imperialism resulted, of course, in World War I. In other words, we can look at this period, the Belle Epoque period. We can't help but look at this period in retrospect as leading to World War I. World War I was, of course, the crisis of Marxism. The question is how Marxism was bound up with the imperialist phase of capitalism, and how the crisis of Marxism was bound up with the result of this period of history. In other words, how the crisis of Marxism itself is bound up with the emergence and a certain crisis of state capitalism, understood as this imperialist epoch. For the Marxists of this time, World War I was the crisis of capitalism in its period of revolution, signaled in a kind of inaugural sense by the Russian Revolution of 1905. Marxists such as Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky regarded this period as one faced with the choice of socialism or barbarism. Or more specifically, the civil war of the workers against the capitalists versus the possibility of a world war between imperialist states. Right, starting as late, in a sense, as 1905, somewhat earlier than this, the prognosis of Marxists of this period was the future is either going to be a civil war of the workers against the capitalists, or it's going to be an inter-imperialist war. Both predictions, in fact, came spectacularly true. Right? In other words, they understood it as either one or the other. As it turned out, it was both. There was a world war and there was a civil war in 1914 to 1919, in which the Second International collapsed and Marxism was divided, specifically on the question of both the imperialist world war and on the question of the class struggle civil war that followed. In other words, if we say that there was a crisis of Marxism, the crisis of Marxism was not only about the war, but was the imperialist war, but it was also about the civil war. Marxism, specifically as a form of politics sui generis, that is distinguished from the greater 19th century history of socialism, from the utopians to Proudhon, Blanqui, Lassalle, Bakunin, and others, that had developed in the preceding period, Marxism did not survive its crisis in World War I and the revolutions that followed. The failure of Marxism can be seen most clearly in the birth of a new right-wing form of politics in this period, fascism, issuing directly out of the crisis of Marxism in World War I. Fascism, 20th century social democratic reformism, 20th century forms of nationalism, i.e. anti-colonialism, and Stalinism were the predominant results of the failed crisis of Marxism from 1914 to 1919. So how are we to regard the history of Marxism post-1919? I would argue that we need to regard the history of Marxism after 1919 as indeed the post-history of Marxism. In other words, not the history of Marxism per se, but rather the history of the memory of Marxism. This memory of Marxism was carried, for the purposes of our project in Platypus, primarily by two figures, Trotsky and Adorno. Trotsky was the survivor of Second International radicalism. Luxemburg died in 1919, and Lenin died in 1924, but even Lenin wasn't very much active after 1919. And Adorno, on the other side, the critical theorist who tried to sustain the insights of two figures of the immediate post-1919 period, Lukács and Korsch, and also tried to sustain the insights of Benjamin, who was himself influenced by Lukács and Korsch. Trotsky and Adorno represented the disintegration of theory and practice that had characterized the crisis and failure of Marxism as a relation of theory and practice, as a form of thinking and as a form of political action sui generis, as it had developed up to 1914. In other words, Marxism developed, we went into a crisis, and then it became divided in its theory and practice, and that these figures can exemplify that. What they really exemplify, rather, though, to be more specific, is not the separation of theory, Adorno, and practice, Trotsky, but rather both Adorno and Trotsky are symptoms of the disintegration of Marxism as a theory and practice. In other words, the theory-practice problem exists on both sides. The memory of Marxism, however, if I'm calling the history of Marxism after 1919 its memory rather than its actual living history, this memory of Marxism haunted the 20th century, especially regarding the grotesque farce of Marxism that Stalinism was. In other words, the 20th century is the century of Stalinism. It's the century of the farce of Marxism. What died in the 1970s, because it already died in the 1970s, not so much in 1989, but really by the 1970s, was not Marxism, but rather the memory of Marxism. Right, so between 1919 and, let's say, 1973, you had the memory of Marxism. That died. The memory of Marxism died. It did not really survive Adorno's death, for example. Not to say that he was the personal embodiment of the memory of Marxism, but it didn't really survive his death. The reason that it might date, in a sense, coincidentally, with the passing of Adorno, who was more of a thinker and not an overtly political actor, is that Trotskyism did not really survive Trotsky's death in 1940. right? In other words, if we were to say Trotskyism is a certain kind of memory of Marxism, well, Trotskyism didn't really survive Trotsky's death either. What is of interest then is how the last great renaissance of Marxism in the 1970s actually marked the death of its effective memory. In other words, how there was an attempt to remember Marxism in the 1970s. The apparent recovery of Marxism in the 1970s was actually its effective obscuring. What we have been living through more recently, say since the 2000s, is the exhaustion and decomposition of the means of obscuring the memory of Marxism. In other words, between the 1970s and the 2000s, there built up this whole apparatus for forgetting Marxism, and we're living through the exhaustion of that. In other words, we're living through the kind of active forgetting of Marxism. The 1990s are specifically an interesting period in this history, as there was already some intimations of the exhaustion of postmodernism. In this sense, 1989, for example, and in a way that Richard likes to put it, can be considered a certain end to the long 60s. In other words, that 89 is an inverted 68. Right? But the effect of the New Left can be seen in the way Stalinism was overcome starting in 1989. Now, I want to say something about Platypus in this regard. There are two generations in Platypus, broadly speaking. The 1990s generation, broadly speaking, and the 2000s generation. And these two generations, within Platypus's own historical experience, express the tensions within the possible recovery of the memory of Marxism against its passing means of effacement. In other words, in the 90s and zeros, you start to have the exhaustion of this obscuring and effacement of Marxism. And what that means is that the potential recovery of the memory of Marxism has two different phases. We can date the historical consciousness of Platypus roughly to 1999 and 2007, right, roughly speaking. Seattle, roughly speaking, the exhaustion of the anti-war movement, 2007. And these two dates interrelate and interact specifically as different modulations of the exhaustion of the processes of obscuring the memory of Marxism. Therefore, our own project has two histories, a history pre-1999 to 2007 and a history pre-2007 to 2011. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. If we compare our historical period with that of 100 years ago, the specificity of our project can be thrown into relief. Whereas Marxism circa 1914 was the culmination of the imperialist phase of post-1873 capitalism, Platypus circa 2012, or a year, faces the tasks of the crisis of the neoliberal phase of post-1873 capitalism. In other words, we are a product of the end of a kind of neoliberal era. In this respect, though, 1873 to 1914 could not contrast more starkly with 1968 or 1973 to 2011, where one, from 1873 to 1914, was a mounting of crisis and a deeply ambivalent process of historical progression and regression. Our period, from 1973 to the present, is one of spiraling decomposition. Right? It's not a sort of dialectical, ambivalent progress-regress, but rather a spiraling decomposition. And this informs the way Platypus must relate to the history of Marxism through the profound contrasts of the post-1873 period versus the post-1973 period. The reason that our project, with respect to Marxism, is unprecedented is precisely because our historical moment is unprecedented. It's without the post-1848 and post-1873 projects of Marxism, and without the memory of Marxism, say circa 1914 to 1973, our period is a post-Marxist time in a totally unparalleled way. We are entering into a time not only very much unlike the post-1873 or post-1914 period, but also significantly different from the 2 decades post-1973. In other words, very different from the 70s and from the 80s, and very different from the 90s and the zeros. This is why our project is so specifically one of the 21st century, of its first and now its second decade. And we need to attend very closely to the various ways in which our project is so conditioned. Reference to the history of Marxism as the ghost that haunts us helps specify the peculiarities of our time, in which fundamental transformation of Marxism is necessary for Marxism to continue in any kind of way, which really means to be reborn, right? Or, in a sense more precisely, to be reincarnated in the traditional sense of the spirit forgetting its past life. Such forgetting today, however, is a pathological repression. We must make Marxism remembered, if, however, unnecessarily obscurely. The 20th century, this period, period of the emergence, crisis, death, memory of Marxism, cannot really be redeemed. Right? In other words, the kind of language of redemption that you find in the Second International, that you find with figures like Rosa Luxemburg, or even with figures who are very much captured by the imagination of that Second International radicalism, like a Benjamin or an Adorno, that notion of redemption doesn't apply for us in the early 21st century the way it once did. The reason that the 20th century cannot be redeemed is that, unlike the 19th century, we can say pretty definitively that the 20th century was one of unnecessary suffering. In other words, we may not be able to say that quite the same way about the 19th century, but we can say that the suffering of the 20th century that humanity has undergone was unnecessary. What that means to say, of course, is that the failure of Marxism was unnecessary. And this is why it cannot be properly forgotten. In other words, if the failure of Marxism had been necessary, was necessary, we could just forget about it. The reason that Marxism can't be forgotten is precisely because its failure was unnecessary. Rather, now, and this is our peculiar situation in terms of coming after an unredeemable century, the entire history of humanity is now filtered through the 20th century. The entire history of humanity is no longer filtered through capital. In other words, Marx would have, as a 19th century thinker, he would have thought that capital is the sort of culmination and crossroads of human history. Rather, for us, we're in a peculiar circumstance. And of course, this is going to sound like a kind of millenarian kind of Marxism become a religion, which is that in the early 21st century, for anyone with any memory of Marxism, the entire history of humanity is now filtered not through capital as an incomplete emancipation, but rather it's filtered through the failure of Marxism. Right? In other words, the entire history of humanity becomes the history of the failure of Marxism. Right? It's no longer the ambivalent history of progress and regress, which is what the 19th century presented. In other words, is the history of civilization, is the history of human development one of progress or of regress? Rather, we're in this other kind of stuck place. That's why all ideology today, unlike in the 19th century, all ideology today is a species of anti-Marxism. In other words, certainly all political ideologies are traceable back to the question of Marxism. Now, finally, I want to say that the reason that Platypus is not about Marxism as the answer, but rather Marxism as the question, is precisely because all ideology is conditioned and contingent upon this failure of Marxism, this question of Marxism. That means that Platypus as a Marxist project is peculiar. It's unlike any other Marxist project historically. And the reason that it's unlike any other Marxist project historically is that it emerged when it did. In other words, why this project, in a sense, couldn't have emerged in the 1970s, couldn't have emerged in the 1980s, couldn't have really emerged in the 1990s. It could sort of begin emerging in the 1990s, but not really. And so that means that, the peculiarity of Platypus is related to the peculiarities of our historical moment. Our historical moment is not unlike any other period prior to us. We cannot pose Marxism as an answer, but only as a question. Now, our claim is not that Marxism is a question, but rather the more emphatic one, which is that Marxism is the question. The question. Now, finally, because of the nature of the last year, 2011, 2012, and Occupy, I have a postscript, and my postscript is on anarchism. In other words, I just narrated 1873 to 1973 vis-a-vis Marxism. Now I'd like to narrate 1873 to 1973 in terms of anarchism. Post-1873, anarchism was a waning ideology, and it was sort of an ideology in the wilderness. The Second International, unlike the First International, the Second International didn't feel any particular political cost to casting anarchism into the shadow, casting anarchism into the oblivion. On the one hand. On the other hand, after 1973, it becomes impossible to avoid anarchism. Right? In other words, after 1873, anarchism could be cast into the shadows. After 1973, there's a way in which everything is kind of anarchisty. Right? Foucault's kind of an anarchist philosopher. Adorno's compatible with anarchism. Everything becomes sort of filtered through anarchism. In some ways, anarchism, and of course, what I mean by this post-1973, is really pseudo-anarchism. Right? We should be careful about that. Pseudo-anarchism is more ideologically prevalent than ever before in terms of the 1873 to 1973 period. Anarchism is a lot more prevalent after 1973 than ever before. So let's talk about the 1873 to 1973 period. I mentioned that anarchism was excluded from the Second International. And again, to the Second Internationalists, it didn't seem that this was to their detriment in any way. The exclusion of anarchism didn't seem like a political liability. However, right, this needs to be qualified. Because starting in 1905, with the Russian Revolution of 1905, there begins to be a changed relationship between anarchism and Marxism. Whereas after 1873, Marxism would have felt entirely justified in regarding anarchism as an antiquated, obsolete ideology. After 1905, that's really no longer the case. And you have splits in Marxism and splits in anarchism that point to a changed relationship between Marxism and anarchism. Starting with 1905, anarchists become Marxists in some numbers, and also Marxists become somewhat anarchisty. And so, for instance, the charge against the radicalization of the Russian Revolution, right? I think that the idea is that Rosa Luxemburg went to Russia in the 1905 revolution and came back an anarchist, right? And then she had to go through great pains to say, no, the mass strike, I don't mean by that anarchism, I mean something else, I mean something about Marxism. And of course, with the Bolshevik Revolution, with the Russian Revolution of October 1917, anarchists also become Marxists yet again. The Third International represents a split, not only in the Second International, but also in anarchism. In other words, the Third International also has the expression of a split within anarchism. Also interestingly, from this period of the failure of the revolutions of 1917 to 1919 until 1973, dissident Marxism takes on the form of anarchism. In other words, starting in that period, dissident Marxists gravitate towards Marxism. And so you get council communism, you get figures that have been mentioned, like Castoriadis or Murray Bookchin. These are all ex-Marxists who moved in the direction of anarchism. And so finally, Adorno, I want to evoke Adorno from 1969, that in the face of the New Left, Adorno said that the return of anarchism is that of a ghost. Nevertheless, he said, and he was paraphrasing Lenin, Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder in this essay, Resignation, he said that Marxism's critique of anarchism was still valid. In other words, the return of anarchism is that of a ghost, and he says its return is because of the failure of Marxism, but that doesn't mean that the Marxist critique of anarchism is not still valid. Marxism's failure to transcend anarchism post-1919, like in other words, why is it that Marxism is dogged by anarchism in this period, in the 20th century, means that anarchism itself becomes an important symptom in the failure of Marxism. Now, this is related. I want to set up two parallels. Anarchism is a symptom of the failure of Marxism in the 20th century, unlike in the late 19th century when the Second International would have considered it an obsolete, antiquated ideology. It comes back. It returns as a ghost, right? But that ghost is a function of the failure of Marxism. Similarly, there's a return of liberalism in the 20th century. Right? In other words, we can talk about the return of liberalism as being the ghost, because it's not really liberalism. It's not 19th century liberalism. The return of liberalism is the ghost of socialism's failure in the 20th century. In a sense, we could say neoliberalism as an ideology, as a policy, as a form of capitalism, it's certainly a post-1973 phenomenon. But neoliberalism as an ideology is a post-1917 phenomenon. Right? So was it just a reactionary ideology, anti-Bolshevik ideology? No. It's an ideology of the failure of Marxism. Neoliberalism is an ideology of the failure of Marxism. So one way in which Marxists sort of impugn anarchism is to say that it is dishonest liberalism, or it's kind of liberalism in denial, or it's kind of hysterical liberalism. Right? What do Marxists mean by that? Because anarchism is the only serious non-Marxian approach to socialism, right? Other versions of socialism are more clearly relapses into ideological kind of liberalism. Anarchism, if you recall Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, she sets up Marxism as resisting the temptations of either anarchism or liberalism. And Lenin also has this in What is to be Done, and this is the kind of language of Second International Marxism, is to say, well, Marxism is consistent socialism in the sense that it doesn't relapse back into liberalism or anarchism. That's the idea. So what this means, however, in the period after the Second International, is that the failure of Marxian socialism has two essential ideological results: neo-anarchism and neoliberalism. Right? The sort of return of emancipatory ideologies of the 19th century that Marxism was supposed to have superseded, but failed to really supersede, so they come back as a ghost. Neo-anarchism and neoliberalism are distinguished not in principle, as their proponents might imagine, but rather only on a spectrum of opportunism. So they're indicative of a symptomatic ideology of libertarian socialism. Libertarianism is merely an ideologically cruder version of anarchism, for example. Right? Or anarchism is a more ideologically overwrought libertarianism. Right? In other words, you could do it that way. You could say that anarchists are libertarians who take themselves too seriously. Libertarians are anarchists who are, happy to be befuddled in their thinking. And by libertarianism, I mean, traditional right-wing libertarianism. Looking back at this history of Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg, Stalinism, for example, which is the big farce of Marxism that both liberalism and anarchism point to impugn socialism and Marxism. Stalinism as a kind of state socialism is not properly to be understood, I think, as authoritarian, but rather as opportunist. In other words, Stalinism, what was wrong about Stalinism was not that it was authoritarian, but rather that it was opportunist. In other words, that it was an adaptation to defeat. It was an adaptation to conditions. It wasn't just a sort of wrong way of doing things, but it was actually a kind of collapse of an emancipatory project. It was a right-wing ideology in that opportunistic sense. Hence, neo-anarchism is, in a sense, a dishonest opportunism or a utopian ideology. The primary character of such ideology is the obscuring of history. In other words, what we're dealing with when we're dealing with neo-anarchism is the obscuring of history. Right, and this is what it means, to wrap up my postscript on anarchism, to say that neo-anarchism lacks historical consciousness, or that it lacks theory, and it replaces such historical consciousness or theory with either anthropology or psychology. Right, in other words, that's why neo-anarchism takes the form that it does of psychology and anthropology, because it is bound up with this active effacing of the history of Marxism. Right, calling it authoritarian, calling it sort of wrongly principled, it effaces that history and is therefore, in a sense, the flip side of Stalinism. In other words, it's a kind of historical opportunism or a kind of opportunistic liquidation of historical consciousness, and is, in a sense, a flip side of Stalinism.
Which is why Maoists can work with anarchists.
Which is why Maoists can work with anarchists. That's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, that's the end of the postscript and the end of the presentation. All right, I'll just take questions for a few minutes, since we're running so far behind schedule. Lilith.
So you spoke about the violence of prior to the 20th century being necessary and after the 20th century being unnecessary. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, about what you mean?
Not violence, but suffering.
Okay.
But suffering. I think that it's significant, for example, that it's only in the post-1873 period, really, that you get, for instance, in the United States, that you get a genocidal policy towards the Native Americans, for example. In other words, certainly there were wars and all sorts of uneven kind of warfare, but a sort of, okay, well now we're just going to wipe them out. That's really a late 19th century thing. Similarly, one can talk about the late 19th century in terms of the rise of a kind of a certain virulent, not a traditional kind of old-fashioned, but a kind of virulent, modern, and sort of genocidal imagination like anti-Semitism. And also the failure of Reconstruction in the United States, the post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States, is really a new kind of racism. In other words, certainly slavery had its racist aspects, but you really get a kind of ratcheting up of racism in the post-1873 period, roughly speaking, which, by the way, is also the collapse of Reconstruction in the United States. And so it's different, right? It foreshadows that period. What I'm saying is that 1873 to 1973 is a way of situating the 20th century as the century of Marxism, and that you start to get foreshadowings of the 20th century after 1873. And that's the whole state capitalism idea I was mentioning. Cam and then Richard.
Chris, in the past you've described this the sort of big capitalist state that emerged after 1873 as Bonapartist in a way. I was wondering if you could just kind of tie that into this framework you were talking about, and how that concept relates to like the modern authoritarian capitalist state.
This is an interesting question because in some ways, what I go with is sort of strict Marx on this one, meaning for Marx, Bonapartism is post-1848. And so what I'm talking about here is the difference between thinking of capitalism and thinking of socialism post-1848 versus post-1873. It's not the case that post-1848, Marx is happy to essentially work with other strands of socialism, right? After 1873, and it's not a matter of Marx's own attitude, but it's really a matter of a sort of trend, that it becomes a question of Marxism, Marxist socialism, right? Marxism per se, which is different. And I think that therefore, if we use that as a kind of an index, and I realize that this is an obscure way of going about things. This is an obscure way of going about things. But to say that, okay, Bonapartism, what's the difference between Bonapartism post-1848 and Bonapartism post-1873? Well, obviously, part of what it's bound up with is the emergence of state capitalism, right? Meaning, if Marx is saying post-1848, the bourgeoisie can no longer rule, and the proletariat cannot yet rule, that kind of characterization comes under an increased pressure and is, in a sense, exacerbated and ratcheted up. It's even more acutely posed post-1873. And, you know, for instance, what's the difference between the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune, for example, right? There's a difference, right? And so in teasing out the self-understanding of Marxism as some kind of an index of changes in capitalism, changes in the workers' movement, the difference between the First International and the Second International. The Second International, of course, has a lot of non-Marxists in it. But the Second International is characterized by the hegemony of Marxism in a way that the First International wasn't, but also wouldn't necessarily have been. In other words, in Marx's own understanding, it's not a function, like the First International, he doesn't seek to make Marxism, whatever that would be, hegemonic in the First International, in a way that Marxism has to be hegemonic in the Second International in order for the Second International to be anything. And that's a curious change then. And it's related to other things. In other words, it's not just a kind of intrinsic development of Marxism, but it's related to changes in capitalism, in the workers' movement, in the character of the bourgeois state. Right. Richard and then Nate.
First of all, I think it was an excellent presentation, but really frustrating. But I have two questions about the periodization, which I sort of have issues. One is like the sort of the assertion that sort of Trotskyism dies with Trotsky in 1940. So that's one thing, and sort of the whole mid-century period, sort of like the period between like the death of Trotsky and
the New Left.
And the New Left, or let's say the death of Trotsky and the beginning of the Spartacist League, sort of that like period of mid-century Marxism, which is the period of the Second World War and its aftermath, when obviously Trotskyism failed in its own terms, but I think represents an significant ideological bridge in terms of the understanding. So I think that that is one ideological hole. The other ideological hole is that it seems to me there's a bit of a collapse in terms of like the 1973 moment, the 1989 moment. So you have like this curious phenomenon. We've talked about the 70s, we talked about the 90s, and we talked about the zeros. So what happens to the 80s? Because the 80s then have a defined character of their own before the collapse of Stalinism,
Right.
when certain type of politics still would seem to make sense. And yet after this efflorescence of the 70s, and I think it's significant that like the two split-offs from the Spartacist League that exist are the IBT and
The IG.
the IG are products of the 80s. And you know, the discussion with the IBT guy, he wouldn't, like, the thing is you can sense that the argument is that the Spartacists became sclerotic, but there wasn't like some defining political split. So I think that thinking about the 80s raises many kind of interesting questions about the nature of our project. And
It does. I mean, I would say that it's maybe a different topic. What I'd say about the 80s is that it's the post-New Left. It's when the left becomes activist and academic in a way that it wasn't in the 60s and 70s. In other words, what we have today, like one of the main...
it's what we're fighting now.
Yeah, it's what we're dealing with, which we'll talk about, I guess, in the internal, in the members' meeting, which is, you know, we've got activism and you've got academicism as leftism and as Marxism, right? Marxism really takes these two forms. And I'm sort of bracketing that question because I think that actually academicism and activism are part of what I'm talking about in terms of the obscuring of the memory of Marxism, right? In other words, if we treat this kind of obscuring of the memory of Marxism, it has two phases. One is the so-called Renaissance of Marxism in the 70s. You know, people get serious about Marxism, they start reading the history of Marxism in a new way, and you get this kind of theory interest in Frankfurt School after Adorno's death. And then that reflorescence of Marxism disintegrates into academicism and activism in the 80s. And so I want to sort of bracket that for a second, though.
And what about the mid-century period, which ties into people like Castoriadis and Socialismo Barbari and so forth?
Well, I mean, we could say that the mid-20th century is the heyday of Stalinism. Right? And it's the heyday of also kind of ersatz Stalinism or quasi-Stalinism, third world nationalism, right? It's, Maoism, I mean, if you think about the Cold War period, it's like films from that period show like, the blob growing. It's like, oh, look at the whole world is becoming like totalitarian. It's the heyday of Stalinism. And again, it's the farce of Marxism. The farce of Marxism does keep the memory of Marxism alive in a certain respect. But it's the farce of Marxism.
But don't you see any strength in a kind of counter-tradition of mid-century Marxism? Because clearly mid-century Marxism has a profound influence just genealogically on everything that follows. And clearly, like the trajectory of someone like Adorno isn't understandable unless one looks at the particular circumstances of the mid-century, which there's both the pre-World War II period, and then isn't there like also the later period, which is formulated by a kind of...
Let me just say this, and then we'll move on to other questions. I would just say this. Neither Trotskyism nor Frankfurt School critical theory went through any development in the mid-20th century. It sort of held its ground at best, and at worst sort of retreated. It didn't, there was no real development there. Ben, and then Nate.
I think I have three questions. One is not related, so I want to
Okay.
go first. It's kind of the dating of Marx and Marxism. Because the Kautsky had this dispute about 1865, is it?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about this this notion of a coming of age of Marxism, which I should preface it. It's the renegade Kautsky, not Kautsky. It's
It's the later.
I think it's nonetheless an interesting question. He's writing in 2014. The second question, do you think that, you mentioned state capitalism and Bonapartist formation, do you think that actually then, I mean, you did kind of touch it in terms of an epochal development, and that obviously pertains to then, because you do, again, you draw a distinction between 1873 and say 1914 and 16 and Lenin and Hilferding and all the rest.
Absolutely.
Because I think in 1873, certainly from my understanding of European history, that kind of state capitalist or direct interventionist choice is a political one, fundamentally, which pertains to the balance of class forces. But following on from that, so I don't think we have a dispute about that, how does this relate to the question of capitalist decline? Which I think that perhaps is something that needs to be explored in terms of understanding the crisis of Marxism itself, i.e. locating the material conditions as to where we're at in the objective world, where we're at with capitalism. Because I don't think just saying this is a crisis of neo-liberalism that's now come to an end actually does get to the dynamics of the entire thing.
Of the present.
Of the present. I mean, I think trying to locate that historically, because that epochal change, whenever we locate it, I think it actually comes early in the imperialist phase of capitalism, but whatever, I mean, it's still important today. And just, I think the last point, I think, is an important one as well in terms of why do you pick out, I mean, I'm not particularly qualified to talk about the Frankfurt School, but certainly Trotskyism. Because is it not the case that Trotskyism is farce? And I know your particular history in terms of the Spartacist League, etc. But I mean, speaking an argument the IBT guy, you just think this is farcical. And there is a level in which I think that does pertain to this whole crisis of Marxism and seeking to overcome it. In that, we cannot, and I think that was Trotsky's mistake. He underestimated the profound paralyzing influence of Stalinism. He located it as something we viewed across the weekend from our Trotsky scholars as a crisis of leadership. I think if it was that simple, great. I think it's far more profound in terms of the program, in terms of class organisation, etc., etc. I think that's one criticism I would have. It reminds me a little bit of a. And it's not it's the character because you're not being that farcical about it. But this red thread that goes through Marx, down to Trotsky, and I just don't.
No, I just put these.
I think that's it actually in some ways undermines your own argument, which I broadly agree with. I mean, what the conclusions then we then draw, I think they're possibly different, but I do agree with.
Let me move backwards through the three questions. This is a difference that Richard and I would have. I think. I don't think that. Well, I don't think the Fourth International Project was viable. But I also don't think the Third International Project was viable. I think the Third International was stillborn. Now, of course, look, Lenin and Trotsky, they were not going to treat the Third International as stillborn. They had to hope against hope, right? And you get something of that flavor in Trotsky, in Trotsky's own Trotskyism, we can put it that way. And, look, not to fault him too much, because when he was writing, people talk about the Russian Revolution as a revolution made by, like, youth, right? Meaning it was like, young conscripts, right? That the Tsar's army had to, conscript younger and younger people. And for Trotsky in 1938, for example, he's saying, in society, the revolution is in living memory. People who are 20 are now 40. They still can make a revolution, right? That's part of his estimation. His estimation is the living memory of the October Revolution. And so, hope against hope, you can't fault the guy for trying, right? I think there's also self-vulgarization, meaning, to say, summed up in the Crisis of Leadership, I think that Trotsky meant something far more supple about that than later Trotskyists took it to mean,
Perhaps, yeah.
right? And so, like I said, his own vision of the possibility of, a revolutionary alternative to Stalinism, it probably did underestimate the problem.
And sorry, just to angle it is still based on First World Congress as the commentary.
Absolutely.
It's not developed, he's upholding it.
It's upholding it, that's right. That's exactly right. And so in that respect, I think the question gets very deep, and it goes back to not the postscript, but my original presentation, when I say literally Marxism can't be understood as the answer, but must be understood as the question. Meaning, I think that the failure of Marxism is profound, and it doesn't mean that there is a Marxism to return to, right? What it means is we need to address that question, the failure of Marxism. And for me, the reason that I'm putting so much weight on 1873, to get to your other questions, the other aspects of your questions, the reason I'm putting so much weight on 1873 is the question of Marxism per se, right? In other words, not the question of socialism, not the question of the socialist workers' movement, but the question of Marxism per se. Because if you say that Marxism is the question, well, that question isn't just posed in 1919 or 1924, certainly not in 1938, or in 1917, or even in 1914. In other words, if you were to have to locate historically the question of Marxism, you'd have to put it in the 1870s. You'd have to say, why is the SPD necessary? Why does it take the form that it takes? Why is it this merging of Lassalleans and Marxists? Why are Marxists happy to join a Lassallean party? Right, famous picture of Rosa Luxemburg that we like to use in Platypus, where she's on the stage and she's flanked by Lassalle and Marx. I mean, she's a Marxist, she's not a Lassallean. She knows what's wrong with Lassalleanism, but she can be in an, obviously a kind of distant mentor for our project is Moïse Postone, and what he'll say about the SPD is that it's a Lassallean party with Marxist verbiage. Right? It was always just a Lassallean party with Marxist window dressing. And my point is that, is there such a thing as a Marxist party? Right? Is there such a thing as a Marxist party? What would that even mean? In other words, is there rather a socialist workers' party that has within it the historical consciousness of Marxism, namely a self-critical attitude towards the socialist workers' movement itself? In other words, a non-straightforward, non-positivistic, vulgar, if you will, not taking, that Marxism never took the socialist workers' movement in its own terms, but always treated it as semi-ideological, so that the history of Marxism is always this critique of Marxism that you have going on, or the critique of socialism, I should say, going on in it. And, so what would it mean then to talk about Marxism as a politics per se? Because it's very peculiar, just as Marxism in a sense of, not exactly a philosophy, but as a theory is very peculiar. Also as a practice, it's very peculiar. And that's why I pointed in my postscript to liberalism and anarchism. In other words, if from a Marxist perspective, socialism always shades off into anarchism or liberalism, always has this kind of character. The socialist workers' movement is always, in a sense, overlain with a kind of anarchisty and liberal kind of ideology, that Marxism is, in a sense, in a constant struggle throughout its history in the socialist workers' movement against opportunism, liberalism, or kind of ultra-leftism, anarchism, or kind of utopian kind of ideology. Then what would that even mean? Now, finally, via the maturity of Marxism, I think that it's curious. In other words, obviously, I'm not one to think that Marx became mature when he wrote Capital and that kind of theoretical like maturity, the mature Marx. Rather, one has to think about Marxism, Marx's own Marxism as a function of political maturity. In other words, what does the later Marx look like as a political figure, right? And that's where the Kautsky, it's kind of an interesting thing, because of course he's accusing Korsch of being one-sided. This is the article that we published, the translation of Kautsky's critique of Korsch. And in a sense, they both have points to score against the other. Korsch has points to score, and Kautsky has points to score. And I think it's because this is a real deep question. In other words, you know, what's the difference between the Communist Manifesto and the program of the Parti Ouvrière? And, you know, how do we understand that in terms of the critique of the Gotha program, right? And it points to, I think, the question of Marxism as a politics, right, not as a theory. So I wouldn't date it to Capital. I would date it to these later, right? Addresses to the First International, absolutely. And I think these are vital, right? They're really vital. Because in a sense, Marx is himself always fending off these criticisms from the left and the right, and he's always characterized by various other socialists as being right-wing. Oh, you like cooperatives? Isn't that right-wing? You like unions? That's right-wing, right? Like Lassalle has a whole critique. And Lukács takes that up, actually. Lukács has a great criticism of, right, the Lassallean critique of Marx for not being political enough. Like, in other words, there is a critique of Marxism as economism by the 19th century socialists, whether it's Bakunin or Proudhon, like there are all sorts of figures in this. So it's kind of fascinating because I would say that, again, Marx doesn't take things like workers' cooperatives or labor unions as goods in and of themselves, like that they're not just good in and of themselves, but rather that they're historical symptoms that need to be attended to. In other words, this is the form that the workers' movement is taking, and we're going to push through these forms. In other words, that these forms are, are the way we're going to grasp the possibility of socialism. They're not to be fetishized, they're not, in and of themselves, and therefore they also can't be critiqued as such. Like, in other words, that, that it's economism, or that it's, I think that Lassalle says it's the objects speaking as objects, like the workers looking out, for their own economic interests. It's objects asserting themselves as objects, not as subjects. Anyway. So, that's why I'd located in this period, which again is the collapse of the First International. Why does the Second International, why did it have to be a hegemony of Marxism? Why did Marxists aim for hegemony in the Second International? Why isn't it more like the First International? These kinds of questions. Nate.
Yeah, I know that this is sort of going into the ball, but one thing that I was thinking of, especially when you mentioned the failure of sort of Reconstruction, is basically like the crisis of liberalism, and exactly how that works in sort of with this kind of thematic, the themes that you've been drawing out of this history. That that the sort of, it seems to me that there's it becomes extremely difficult to sort of, when does the crisis of liberalism stop just being the necessity of Marxism, but the failure, like a symptom of the failure, exactly, and how does that sort of correlate, or how does it sort of, not correlate, but how's that bound up with this sort of, or it seems to me like maybe it's bound up with this, change from Marx to Marxism, that shift and what's sort of entailed with that politically.
But there are two dates for that. I mean, what I'd say quickly is that for Marx, certainly liberalism is dead as an emancipatory ideology by 1848, right? Definitely, because it's, it's the liberals who are putting down the June insurgents in 1848, just as with the Commune later, right? And so again, we could say, liberalism, dies a couple of different deaths in the 19th century, and that the death that it dies in 1848 is different than the death that it dies in the 1870s, right? And, it can be a kind of ratcheting up. What we could say is that from a Marxist perspective, certainly in terms of Marxists' own self-understanding, the necessity of socialism only grows between 1848 and 1873. Like, I think that Engels, in one of his prefaces to, is it the preface to the class struggles in France, where he talks about, we underestimated the progressive capacities of capitalism. But then he, what people usually make of that is something other than what I take from it, because he points to the evidence of progress for Engels is the growth of the socialist workers' movement. Right? In other words, it's not just the productive capacities of capitalism. It's not just the economic growth of capitalism. But rather, what he was saying was, we underestimated in 1848, Marx and I underestimated, the degree to which capitalism could still contribute to the growth of the socialist workers' movement. That's really what it's about. It's not about, oh, well, capitalism can grow economically, because you could say that capitalism in some ways continues to grow economically, even if it sort of slows down, or it continues to grow economically. But for Engels, the only question of historical progress in terms of capitalism is the degree to which it facilitated the growth of the socialist workers' movement. And that's what we have not seen, right, since 1970, certainly since 1973, but really since 1919, right? Okay, and Jeremy, and then I think that'll be it.
It's sort of a follow-up on that question, actually, because I also agree with Richard that it was a great presentation. My follow-up question, though, is I guess I want to be like sort of vulgar and say that, okay, so the infamous, 1859 preface, right? Marx, productive forces, relations of production, right? It seems to me that saying that the 20th century is just one big ball of unnecessary suffering misses a little bit of the continuing sort of strange character of what it means to live through the period we're living in the sense that, like, I know, Chris, I've heard you indeed talk about, like, the fact that banking develops in ever more coordinated ways to make ever more massive social investments is, like, on the one sense, just a sign of, like, continuing tragedy. But on the other hand, like, also still seems like replete with some kind of possibility. Again, the, like, classic productive forces, you could say, but, society still possessing some sort of possibility for another world. So it seems to me that the 20th century is sort of just unnecessary suffering, fails to get a little bit at that element, like the continuing demand for socialism that comes through the continuing development of the productive forces, the fact that capitalism hasn't, like, shut down yet. And then, parallel to that is the issue with the 19th century, which, again, I also felt was a little too simple in the sense that, like, Marx in the Communist Manifesto did think that the rest of the 19th century was unnecessary, right?
Yes.
Like, and he might have sort of revised that view, or at least sort of had to reflect on why it didn't work out, why 1848 worked the way it was. But in a sense, like, the rest of the 19th century was only necessary projectively, like, in the sense that it could have been redeemed by the growth of Marxism. It wasn't kind of on a pure level, like, yeah, so I guess the 20th century seems to me maybe a little more necessary, or not just unnecessary suffering, and the 19th century seems more like terrible, not necessary suffering.
The reason that I put it that way, and of course it's really tendentious on my part to put it that way in certain respects, is the question of Marxism. Meaning, will Marxism play a role in any future achievement of socialism? If it does, it will have turned out that the 20th century was unnecessary. If it doesn't, then maybe the 20th century was necessary. In other words, if Postone and Castoriadis and Bookchin, if these people are right, in other words, if the history of Marxism as a politics, not as some theory of capital, but as a politics, if the political history of Marxism, 1873 to 1914, or 1875 to 1919, like you can date it in different ways, if that history ends up not really playing any kind of role in the achievement of socialism, then you could say, okay, the 20th century was, some agonizing, long, but necessary transcendence of Marxism, right? The New Left was right. The New Left was right. That's why it's 1973. In other words, if despite the failure of Marxism, the world still achieves socialism, then the New Left will have been right, right? But if Marxism still has a necessary role to play, then the New Left was wrong. And it's not the case that 1917 was too early, and that we had to wait until the post-World War II period to have real socialism. Right? You see, that's where the pressure is. The pressure is on both dates. Like, the way you're posing it now puts the pressure on 1973. Right? The way we were talking about it before puts the pressure on 1873. But if we put the pressure on 1973, then what we're talking about is Marxism necessary? In what way is it necessary? And also, is it necessary as a theory? Is it necessary as some kind of a history of political practice? You know, some relationship of theory and practice? In what way is Marxism necessary? Like, why should a project that started in the 2000s be Marxist? Why can't it be post-Marxist? Why can't it say, well, Marxism has some contributions to make, but look at all these other things, right? Why does it have to be Marxist? Ben, and then Greg.
Yeah, so I want to go a little further on this idea of Marxism not being the answer for the question, and that we can't have a sort of positive vision of Marxism. So you said in your presentation that like the history of Marxism really ends in 1919, so Stalin isn't a Marxist, Mao isn't a Marxist. So why aren't they Marxists? Well, they're not Marxists because they've abandoned the original like emancipatory aspirations of Marxism. That like Marx believed capitalism creates the possibility for humanity to emancipate itself from class society, to leap from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, however you want to put it. That's okay, so that possibility doesn't seem to be very active today. So like the question for me is like, what would it take to make that possibility active again? So it seems like what you're saying is the only way to do that is to work through the history of the 20th century.
I'm not exactly saying that. I mean, get back to Ben Lewis's question for a second about Trotskyism. Yes, Trotskyism is the farce of Marxism in another sense, in the sense that it's not the practice of Marxism in the way that Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky prior to the Russian Revolution can be said, okay, these were like people who, in a sense, you know, lived the relationship of theory and practice, right? Were involved in a kind of practice of Marxism that Trotsky kicked out, Trotsky in exile, Trotsky trying to start the Fourth International, is not really ever achieving a Marxist political practice. He wants to, but he never actually achieves it. And that's what makes that history more qualified. In other words, you know, I can't say that, you know, it's simply the case that, you know, Trotsky in the 20s and 30s is a practicing Marxist in the way that Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky were prior to 1917, or in the, you know, revolution of 1917 to 1919. And so that, when I say Stalin and Mao are, you know, or Stalinism is the farce of Marxism, part of what makes it the farce of Marxism is not that they've given up some like ideal or something like that, but rather that the practice, the political practice, really has nothing to do with Marxism. And you could also say that about Trotsky.
But couldn't you say that Trotskyism is the tragedy of Marxism, not the farce? I mean, there is a farcical quality.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's tragic. I would say that actually the tragedy, Marxism is a tragedy. Marxism is a tragedy. Not, right, in other words, the whole history of Marxism is a tragedy that Trotsky continues in a certain way. But it's not like the tragedy only comes with Trotsky. Lenin, to me, is a tragic figure. Not only Luxemburg, but Lenin is a tragic figure also, right? And in that sense, Marx himself, right? Marx and Engels themselves. Greg, and that will be it.
Okay. I wanted to ask specifically for you to clarify what implications you draw from your presentation for Platypus as a specific kind of Marxist organization, because you seem to imply that there are implications for Platypus being an unprecedented organization that corresponds to unprecedented historical times. I mean, Ben Lewis has suggested that he agrees with the rough outline of the history and the problems that you pose, while also saying that he believes he differs practically on what it means. In your account, Chris, it seems difficult that one could disagree on the implications based on acceptance of your account. You also raised a very interesting ambiguity about whether or not the 20th century was unnecessary, saying that if Marxism as a guiding ideology of socialist revolutionary politics becomes ascended, then that will have in fact demonstrated that the 20th century was unnecessary, which I think betrays me of an optimism that it will at one point become such a guiding ideology again. But if that's the case, then how are we to understand, I guess, our own present ambiguity in terms of hastening, or at any rate encouraging.
Right.
tendencies
This
that
gets a
the
little
things
bit
develop.
right. This gets a little bit beyond the purview of the talk. But I will just answer this, and then we have to break because we need to switch to the organizational meeting. But this is the way I'd put it. It's the metaphor that I used in the talk of the difference between ambivalent progress and regress and exhaustion. In other words, the opportunity for our project is not what Marxists historically would have called a dialectic of history, but rather the opportunity of our project is more kind of an exhaustion of history. Namely, I think that, in terms of what I've described as the 20th century as the memory of Marxism, right, that whole question. The question is, what's the possibility of the memory of recovery of the memory of Marxism? What would that, involve? I think that a casualty of the failure of Marxism was the workers' movement itself. In other words, I think that despite the 30s, and certainly 60s, 70s, despite any kind of 70s like labor militancy, I think what we're talking about is not just the failure of Marxism, but the failure of the socialist workers' movement. And that in a sense, Marxism is the kind of key expression of the kind of emergence, crisis, death, and failure of the socialist workers' movement itself. In other words, if we talk about Stalinism as a kind of farce of Marxism, it's also a farce of the workers' movement. Stalinism is also the farce of the workers' movement. And that's why you get liberalism and anarchism in the way that you do in the 20th century, as these kind of haunting ghosts. In other words, when someone like Friedrich Hayek says, well, fascism had its roots in the Second International, when he looks at, in real kind of a benign case, Austrian social democracy, he says, well, the fascist, uniforms, the fascist camping expeditions, right, the fascist culture has its roots in the Second International. It would be horrific if that were true, right? But the question is, why would that appear to be true? In other words, what makes Hayek's imagination possible, right? And why does it take the form not of a new ideology, but of a neoliberalism? Right? In other words, it's not that the 20th century came up with something new in the failure of Marxism. Nothing new came in the 20th. This is one of the reasons why the 20th century is unnecessary suffering. It's all just a rehash that comes with the failure of Marxism. And Hayek doesn't come up with something new. He returns to liberalism, right? He goes back, right? He says, oh, okay, Marxism, socialist workers' movement, that was just a sort of wrong blind alley that people went down. And what we need to do is go back to liberalism. So you see some of what I'm saying is that you don't get new ideologies in the 20th century. What you get is a kind of recrudescent of old ideologies. And I think that's also indicative. Right? And I think that, neoliberalism, emphatic neoliberalism is curious in this respect.
Whereas by contrast, the 19th century was
all new
ideologies.
All new ideologies. Like the 19th century just proliferates ideologies. The 20th century just rehashes ideologies.
Even fascism?
Fascism is the one exception.
What about Islamism?
Islamism is a new ideology?
Certainly in Iran, it's not that it's a return per se to any of the old caliphates.
And I guess the point stands, these are all right-wing.
Well, they're all right-wing.
ideologies.
Look, I guess maybe fascism, the reason that we could talk about
fascism.
we could talk about ideology in a million different respects, but liberalism and anarchism have a critique of Marxism and of socialism that claim to be emancipatory, that don't claim to be conservative. They claim to be emancipatory. In other words, Hayek's perspective is that there's no more emancipatory ideology than liberalism. Liberalism is the emancipatory ideology. Islamism, fascism is another curious kind of phenomenon.
There's romanticism.
In the 20th century?
No, as a precursor to fascism.
Yeah, but So I think that, again, if we take seriously the distinction between the left and the right, liberalism and anarchism are of the left. They are of the left, in the sense of emancipation.
Well, the ideological roots of fascism lie in the late 19th century, actually in the 1870s.
In the 1870s.
And similarly, you could say the same thing about Islamism. I mean, as
Okay.
political phenomena, but anyway.
Let's close and take a break before our organizational meeting.
Everybody grab a cupcake.
It's better than being hot. No, it's just a break. Cold is a great thing. Yeah. Cold is very, I'm sickly.
Do you want to turn it off? I'm not going to touch it.
Oh, yeah.